Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. My name is Daniel McAdams. I'll be your host today. Dr. Paul is traveling. I have with me a good friend and old friend from Capitol Hill days who's joining me today to discuss the final report on the shoot-down of the Malaysian Airlines flight MH-17, and that is Ray McGovern. Ray has had a very rich 27-year career as a CIA analyst, starting in the Kennedy administration. So what a rich source of information he is. He's a co-founder of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Peace. He's a peace activist. He also joined Dr. Paul several times on the Hill at different briefings that we gave for members of Congress and for staff. Ray, thank you so much for joining us.
Most welcome, Daniel.
Well, let's take a look at what happened a little over a year ago over eastern Ukraine. Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur was shot down on July 17th. Tragically, 298 people on board were all killed. The flight was flying over a war zone in Ukraine. That war zone came about, as we remember, because of a U.S.-backed coup in Kiev in February that overthrew the elected government. The people in the eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region, were not going to go along with the U.S.-backed government, and they decided they wanted to break away. So it was a war zone. Almost immediately after the shoot down of the plane, however, the U.S. Seemed to know what had happened. They immediately started pointing the finger at Russia for shooting down the plane. It was just days later that John Kerry said, quote, "There is an enormous amount of evidence that Russia was involved in the shoot down." Pressed for more details, the State Department spokesman said, "We have a lot of social media and videos that we've seen that proves Russian involvement." Ray, how do you assess this initial finger pointing and offering social media as evidence?
Well, as an intelligence officer and as a citizen who knows how many billions of dollars we expend each year on very sophisticated satellite and other collection mechanisms, it boggles the mind that all John Kerry could adduce was social media, which he described as an extremely useful tool. Now, yeah, okay, tool for what? For information or disinformation? And I'm afraid that the campaign to blacken Russia and, of course, Putin took precedence over the truth and witnessed the fact that John Kerry got up on all the TV Sunday shows and said it was Putin, it was the Russians, it was the Russians, it was Putin, the pro-Russians and all that business, and adducing just social media. Now, he did say one other thing, Daniel, and this is something that has escaped attention. I have it here, I want to read it because I want to get the quote exactly right. On NBC with David Gregory, this is what John Kerry said, and I quote, "We picked up the imagery of this launch. We know the trajectory. We know where it came from. We know the timing. And it was exactly at the time that this aircraft disappeared from the radar." Whoa, end quote. How? Wow. Where is that evidence?
That sounds like more than social media. It sounds like he has something very, very compelling. Is there a way that they could release that information that wouldn't compromise their sources and methods and all these sorts of things? Could it be sanitized and released?
Of course it could. The problem, the fly in the ointment, Daniel, is that it doesn't, in my view, dovetail with the charges that Kerry made 3 short days after the incident. That's why they're not releasing. You know, people say sources and methods, sources and methods. Do you remember back in the late 80s when Ronald Reagan sent bombers to kill Gaddafi and actually did kill one of his sons because the Libyans were involved in an incident at a bar in Berlin, killing 2 U.S. soldiers? Do you remember that?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, the public in the world wouldn't buy that explanation. And so Reagan came to us and said, "Look, we've got to show the source." And we said, no, you can't do that. It's an intercept, it's encoded, and it will blow our source. And Reagan said, "Show the source." And the source said, mission accomplished. We accomplished this at 2:45 this morning. Hooray, hooray. Now, what's the precedence here? What should be given priority? If we have that kind of information, as Kerry claimed, we should make that public. We have all kinds of sources of information. We can sanitize it. The reason it's not being made public is because, in my view, Kerry lied, and it's not the first time.
Well, as you know, Ray, yesterday the Dutch Safety Board released its final report on the shoot down of the plane. I don't think either of us were overwhelmed with the information contained in the report. The two main conclusions are: one, it was hit by a Buk missile, and two, Ukraine should have closed its airspace because it was a war zone. And that was about all we got out of it. From what we see from the Russian side, the Dutch-led team refused to consider evidence produced by the manufacturer of the Buk missiles. They did a mock test of the Buk, and they had determined that it was actually the type of missile that had been out of commission in Russia since about 2011, but the Ukrainians were still using. Who knows what it proves, but it wasn't considered. The other thing that was interesting about the investigation is it seems like there are three possible perpetrators, unless you want to go into heavy conspiracy, and that would be the Ukrainians, the Russians, or the rebels. How is it that the Ukrainians, one of the potential suspects, were involved in the investigation? That seems pretty unprecedented. Yeah.
So why the Belgians? I mean,
Yeah.
Most people who are pretty much vassals of the United States running the investigation. And where are the black boxes?
Yes.
Why were the black boxes given to the UK? I mean, have you heard anything about the black boxes? So the whole thing is just so transparently corrupt. What Kerry saw, in my view, was a target of opportunity. Now, that's no play on words. He saw that he could exploit this against Putin. Now, why did he need to do that? Because he had all these neoconservatives behind him saying, you gave up our war on Syria. Just in August and September of 2013, we were all ready to attack Syria, and you worked out a deal with Putin to have all those chemical weapons in Syria destroyed. So Kerry sort of felt the need to rehabilitate his anti-Russian connections, okay? And it's exactly the same motivation that led George Shultz under Ronald Reagan in 1983 to accuse the Russians of deliberately downing KAL-007, which had, I think, 269 passengers on it, deliberately knowing in advance that it was a civilian aircraft. That was a lie. That was a lie, and the reason we know that's a lie is because the video fellow from the State Department, who was asked to give that for presentation at the UN just 1 week later, we're talking September 1st, 1983, and it was a week later, I think the 7th of September, he confessed in a book he wrote, and he wrote a book calling Warriors of Deceit. And what he said was this: I was only given 7 minutes of this video between ground control and pilot. Now, the whole video made it very clear the Russians didn't know it was a civilian plane, but they didn't give me that, you know? Now, what lesson did he draw from that, Daniel? The lesson he drew was this: the moral is all countries, including the United States, lie. The victory goes to whomever lies first. Whoever lies first wins. Well, I see a direct parallel here. Kerry was similarly motivated. Schultz had been knocked around by Weinberg and the others for not being anti-Soviet enough. Now Kerry's going to make sure he shows himself to be anti-Russian enough, even if it means, as Secretary of State, lying. And you know, I have to say this, that I've been watching Russia for 50 years. I've never seen a general secretary of the Soviet foreign policy or a Russian president or premier call a U.S. Secretary of State a liar. But Putin did so in Petersburg on the very day that Obama arrived for a summit. What Putin said was Kerry's words about the moderates in Syria and the chemical attacks which he attributed to Bashar al-Assad, they were wrong. Он врет, он знает, что врет, это печально, which means he's lying, he knows he's lying. This is really sad. Putin about Kerry. Now, you know, these things are all fair in love and war, as some people like to put it, but they're not when lives are at stake. And when people like John McCain is unleashed to say, you know, really ought to risk war for Russia. Why? Well, because it just seems like a good idea to me.
Yeah, and it seems as if, for example, when Kerry spoke on the Ghouta attack, as you pointed out last year, or in 2013, and also about the shoot-down last year, it sort of set the stage for the lapdog mainstream media in the U.S. to sort of fall into line. And this continues to this day. You know, right when the Dutch report came out, I was looking at how the reaction was in the mainstream media, and you have CNN, which reported the report found the plane was shot down over Ukrainian territory controlled by pro-Russia separatists. Fox News, not to be outdone, said the crash was downed by a Russian missile. Both of those are sort of technically, in a way, true, but distorted in such a way to tell the tale that they wanted to. Seems like the propaganda continues, Ray.
Well, that's true. And you're adducing both examples of Kerry, both with respect to the charges that it was Bashar al-Assad that mounted those chemical attacks on August 21, 2013, and the visceral rising to the occasion for that target of opportunity, literally, on MH-17. You know, that betrays a kind of, it betrays a kind of a loose and fast, or fast and loose attitude toward the intelligence. Now, to its credit, my former colleagues refused to go along with both of those charges. How do we know that? Because in the past, the genre that would be brought forward would be an intelligence assessment, obviously, okay? Guess what? Kerry could not get my colleagues to sign on to an intelligence assessment either after the chemical attacks in Syria or after MH-17 was down. Why? Because they didn't believe it. So what did he do? He had to adduce a new genre, a whole new genre of report, a government assessment. What does that mean? Government assessment is prepared in the White House and State Department by a bunch of political hacks. And by making it a government assessment, you lessen the likelihood that one of my former colleagues who's honest would go to WikiLeaks and say, this is a crock. This is not an intelligence assessment. It's something else. It's a propaganda tool.
Really wouldn't know the difference, and thanks to you and your colleagues for letting us know that there is a huge difference. We're going to have to go in a second, Ray, but I want to ask you one final thing. You mentioned McCain, our favorite neoconservative. Well, he did a piece yesterday in CNN where he said we really need to confront Putin. One of his suggestions, he had two suggestions, I'm sure you'll like both of them. One is we need to sign on to the Petraeus strategy, which is to align ourselves with Al-Qaeda. He didn't say it, but that's what Petraeus said. But the second one I was going to ask you, including we need to help the Ukrainians be able to kill more Russians. And, you know, Ray, you've been involved in the thick of things in some of the worst times. You mentioned KAL 007. I remember that. It was very tense. You were an insider in some of the worst times between the U.S. and Soviet Union in relations. How would you assess our current state based on some of what you've seen? Are we worse now? Is there more danger, less danger?
More danger because of the neocons. Now, some of the presidents I served, including George H.W. Bush, called the neocons the crazies. His word, okay? He kept them at middle levels of our government. He couldn't dismiss them because the Republican Party would be up in arms, but he kept them in places where they couldn't do irreparable harm. Now, they're all over the place. Now, I will say this for Obama. He's shown himself a little bit reluctant to simply salute to the neocons, witness what he did with respect to Iran. So I think that behind the scenes, Obama and Putin, despite all the harsh rhetoric, know that they can have an opportunity here if they seize it to cooperate on places like Syria, despite the McCains of this world.
We'll have to leave it at there, Ray. Thank you so much for joining us and giving your broad, vast experience and helping us understand these issues. I hope we can have you back sometime soon, Ray.
Thanks, Daniel.
I'd like to thank everybody else for joining the Ron Paul Liberty Report today. Please come back and see us soon.